So this video is going to be looking at the causes of the civil war between Pompey and Caesar. So we'll have Caesar's version of the situation. We'll have three letters, from Cicero, a fairly chunky section of Suetonius, and a section of Plutarch to have a look at. So we're going to be looking at the causes of the civil war from these different perspectives. Now, weirdly, I'm not going to start with the first source in this section. So I'm going to come back to this Caesar civil war, and I'm going to scroll down. And I'm going to scroll past Cicero's letters as well. I'm going to start with Suetonius and the Plutarch source, mainly because they give us the overview of the story before we come back to the contemporary versions of what happened. So we'll start with Suetonius, because Suetonius is always useful for helping to explain events in the right order, roughly. So he's talking about Caesar took equal pains to win the support of kings and provincial authorities everywhere. So he's making himself really popular. Basically, he was sort of sending auxiliaries to where they wanted to take over lands, etc. And he was doing this all without the permission of the Senate or any tribunes. So he's acting basically beyond his brief and is going beyond what he should have been doing as the provincial leaders. He also sort of does some really nice building works. Not building works, sorry. He sort of put some nice statues and stuff in places. And essentially, everyone's kind of questioning what Caesar is up to and thinking we need to do something about Caesar because he is going far beyond what he should be doing. And there is still this issue to do with, just reading through, with his first consulship, with his the Lex Campania and the way it was passed illegally, etc. So we have a consul called Marcellus, announced he intended to bring a matter of vital public interest before the Senate, and therefore proposed, since the Gallic War had ended, which is what Caesar had been fighting, and peace was now established, Caesar to be relieved of his governorship before the end of his term. They then replace him, and they disband his army. Okay, so basically they want to take the command off Caesar. He then also proposes that Caesar be prohibited from standing for the consulship unless he appeared in Rome. Now, partly that is to ensure that Caesar would then become a private citizen and then could be prosecuted. It's also to do with some of the laws that Pompey had passed. Now, remember, Pompey had been sole consul in 52 BC. And as part of his sole consulship, he passed a series of different laws that were trying to sort of solve some problems in the Republic. So he passed an anti-bribery law, but he also passes another law, which is described here. So he referred to Pompey's bill regulating official privileges, which disbarred absentee candidates from office. And Pompey had neglected to exclude Pompey's name from this bill. And he hadn't corrected the oversight and just left it to go through. So Caesar would not be allowed to do this. So it kind of clears up that loophole that Caesar, when he first went for his first consulship, he had used that law. Obviously, he then gave up the triumph and then came into the city anyway. And obviously at the time, Cato said, he's doing this illegally. And obviously he wasn't, because otherwise it wouldn't have been an issue, really. So Pompey's law has kind of basically tidied up this kind of slight loophole in the law and has neglected to leave Caesar's name from the bill, from the law. Now, this is quite interesting because obviously Caesar and Pompey and Crassus had worked together during the first triumvirate and had helped in each other's aims. So there's obviously been this sort of a big falling out, and part of it is to do with Crassus's death. So Crassus obviously died in Syria in 54 BC, and they now don't have this kind of third side of the triangle, as it were, and obviously you need three opposing forces for something to create stability, if we go back to Cato's prediction, and now you've just got these two men. Well, now Caesar's becoming really famous in the Gallic Wars. He'd done, if you're not French, he'd done amazing things. He'd conquered the Gallic regions, he had subjugated people, he became very rich and very famous as a result of it. Now, Pompey had been a great military leader, but hasn't done any military campaigning since the 60s, especially after he was injured. So there's an element here of Pompey had grown a little bit jealous of Caesar's reputation. As well as this, during obviously Pompey's sole consulship, he was promoted to that position by Cato and Cicero. So he's got this new alliance, and he's basically been pulled away from Caesar by Cicero and by Cato, and has gone back into the Optimate camp. Another reason why these two men have fallen out is that Caesar's daughter had died during childbirth, and Pompey was very grief-stricken, and now they don't have this kind of political marriage holding them together as well. And now we've also got Pompey basically forgetting, in inverted commas, to exclude Caesar from legislation that would have attacked him. Fine. So not content with trying to deprive Caesar of his command of privilege previously voted to him, the Marcellus also then sort of votes that some of the colonists that Caesar had set up lose their citizenship. So Caesar had extended citizenship to quite a lot of people in Gaul, and this annoyed the Senate quite a lot because he wasn't really meant to do that. So provoked by these measures, Caesar, suggested he was now the leading man of Rome, which is probably true, to be fair to Suetonius, basically then starts to resist it because he's pretty unhappy about the way he's being treated, kind of understandably. So he persuaded the tribunes of people to use their vetoes, and he also uses Rufus, Marcellus's co-consul. So he's got alliances forming as well. So the year after, we have another Marcellus, which is very helpful, succeeds his cousin, also the same name, of course, and they tried to pass through the same measures. So Caesar heavily bribed the other consul, Aemilius Paulus, and Gaius Curio, the most impetuous of the tribunes, to secure their support. So this Curio person becomes quite important later on. So Caesar is not even in Rome, and he's obviously controlling politics to some extent by using his alliances. However, obviously his opposition is relentless, so he makes a written appeal to the Senate, asking to retain the privilege granted him by the Commons, i.e. keep his provincial command, and if he has to step down, that all other commanders be required to resign as well. So in other words, he doesn't want, him to be sort of left without protection with other people who've got armies, it kind of makes sense, I guess. He was confident it was thought of mobilising his veterans whenever he wished, more swiftly than Pompey than his new levy. So Pompey was raising an army at the time on an instruction of the Senate. He finally proposed a compromise, offering to relinquish 8 legions and quit Transalpine Gaul, but retain 2 legions and Cisalpine Gaul until he was elected as consul. So basically he's trying to ensure he can't be prosecuted, but also ensure that he's not going to be attacked by Pompey and his army. And it is a good compromise, because essentially he's saying, I will reduce my forces so it matches Pompey's, and that way neither of us can attack each other because we're equally matched. But the Senate refuses to intervene on his behalf and basically doesn't allow it to occur. So as a result of that, then, so Caesar crossed into Cisalpine Gaul. So he's heading back towards Rome. And this indeed became the pretext for civil war. Oh, I didn't highlight the R, I'll just highlight that now. Although other motives are suspected. So it wasn't just to do with this issue with the consulship, there were other issues coming through. So according to Suetonius, Pompey used to say that Caesar desired general turmoil and confusion. I'm not sure that's true, but okay. Others say he feared the necessity of accounting for his actions, in which he disregarded the laws, the auspices, and all vetoes during his first consulship. So he's basically talking about the passing of the Lex Campania here, and the legal way that Caesar had done it. So if he does come back into Rome as a private citizen to run for the consulship, he could be prosecuted, and that is his fear. And Cato had often pledged to impeach him the moment his army was disbanded. So he knows he's kind of been backed into a little bit of a corner here, which is why I always say it's not, the civil war is often portrayed as just kind of Caesar's fault. It wasn't just his fault. He obviously does take some really poor decisions, but there is an element of him being attacked sort of legally, and he was being kind of pushed into a corner, and that's always a very dangerous situation to put somebody who's got a great army into a corner. Then he gets he quotes another source which you don't need to worry about. It says that Caesar said, they chose this, they would have condemned me, Gaius Caesar, despite my victories, if I'd not sought the army's help. So clearly Caesar blames the Senate. Some claim that the constant exercise of power made him enamoured of it, i.e. he just really wants to be really powerful, and he grasps this chance of seizing dictatorship, and that he'd always wanted to do it, according to Suetonius, which I don't agree with at all personally, but you can disagree with me if you want to. So that's fine. So then the veto has been disregarded, so he's unable to stop himself being prosecuted. He then sends in some sort of scouts ahead of him, and he sort of puts on a big show, starts building a gladiatorial school, he's sort of dining, he's doing all this sort of thing to make him look like he's not bothered, and that he's not really sort of trying to come back into Rome at all. However, in secret, he then sort of overtakes his advance guard at the river Rubicon. And the river Rubicon is really important. It's basically, I shouldn't really call it a river, it's a stream, really. It doesn't even exist anymore. This is like the legal boundary of Italy. So once you cross the river Rubicon, you're basically declaring war on Rome, because you have to disband your army officially as general at that particular point. So he knows if he crosses this, there is no going back, quite literally. So he pauses for a while and starts kind of thinking, oh, am I doing the right thing? As he stood there and decided, he received a sign. So there's some weird omeny, weird thing about trumpets you don't need to worry about. The important thing is, whatever he saw or whatever thinking he had, he then exclaims, let us follow the summons of the God's sign and our enemies just as the die is cast. So in other words, he has no choice. So he decides to cross the river. And crossing with the army, he welcomed the tribunes of the people who'd fled to him. So he's got those supporters. It is even said, sorry, I'm just going to unhighlight that. It said that he promised every man there promotion to the equestrian order and the 4,000 gold pieces. So there is an element of, there's a rumour that he was using largesse, which is what these is, and the promotion of people into different orders. But according to Tony, that's just a misunderstanding. That in actually what he said was he kept pointing his left hand and crying out he would gladly reward those who championed his honour. So you kind of suggest that he was going to reward them somehow, but whether or not it's that specific idea about the equestrian order and the gold pieces is something that Suetonius does question. So that's one version of the story. We then have the Plutarch source, which basically tells us exactly the same thing but in a slightly different way. You'll be pleased to know. So Caesar now sent to Rome asking to be allowed for consulship, to have his own provincial command prolonged, as we know that already. First, Pompey himself did not declare himself either way, but Marcellus and Lentulus opposed Caesar's request. We know this already. They'd always hated Caesar, and they now used every means, fair or foul, to dishonour and discredit him. So there's an element of members of the Senate were the cause of the civil war between the two of them. Okay, so Caesar was already in the most lavish way making available to public figures in Rome the wealth he had won in Gaul. So Caesar's sending gold back from Gaul to Rome. Obviously that's going to win people over, including he paid the enormous debts of the tribune Curio, and he also gave the consul, who obviously was then elected, 15,000 talents, which is a lot of money. So there's an element of bribery going on here. So we end up with this division forming. So Pompey and his friends began to work for having Caesar replaced by a successor in his provincial command, as mentioned in the Suetonius source. So Caesar sent soldiers back after giving each man a present of 250 drachmas, so more bribery. The officers who brought these troops back to Pompey publicly spread rumours about Caesar, so they start spreading some false rumours, because they're basically trying to it says in effect of warping Pompey's judgment and filling him with false hopes. So they're kind of sort of trying to lull Pompey into thinking he can easily defeat Caesar, that Caesar's giving up really easy, and that will kind of make Pompey quite arrogant, etc., and won't prepare himself. So as a result of that, all this fed Pompey's vanity. He took no measures for the raising of troops. So in here is the rumours if you want to read it for yourself. I haven't bothered highlighting it. And he basically thinks that he can just kind of give some speeches and win, and then that'll be the end of it. Fine. So Caesar then makes some demands that look fair enough. So this is about the giving up of the different soldiers. He suggested was that he should lay down his arms and that Pompey should do the same thing, which is perfectly reasonable, I think. And then when they're both as order citizens, see what favour they could find with their fellow citizens, i.e. put it to a vote and, you know, whoever wins the election, then there's your answer. So Curio is now working for Caesar. He's been bribed to do so, put these proposals before the people, and he was applauded. So the people seem to be on Caesar's side. We also then have the first mention of Marcus Antony, who had been fighting with Caesar in the Gallic Wars, and he was a tribune. So he produced in front of the people a letter which he received from Caesar on these points, and everybody's really happy about it. In the Senate, Scipio proposed a motion that Caesar should be declared a public enemy. So this is like a step up of what Suetonius was talking about, if he had not laid down his arms before a certain date. So it does seem to be escalating. The consuls put the question first whether Pompey should disband his troops, and then whether Caesar should. Only a very few senators voted for the first proposal. Nearly everybody voted for the second. But when Antony once more demanded that both should lay down their commands, the Senate welcomed his proposal unanimously. However, Scipio protests this, so in the end, there is no agreement, which that last sentence talks about. So there is this issue about the two armed forces which I described earlier. Soon letters came from Caesar, which were even more moderate in tone. He agreed to give up everything else, only asking for Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum with 2 legions, which is mentioned in Suetonius, which he would retain till he stood for his second consulship, so he'd be protected from prosecution. Cicero was working for a reconciliation and was trying to make Pompey taking up a less rigid attitude. So Cicero, although according to other sources he's kind of steering the situation, is also trying to possibly, according to Plutarch, trying to calm the situation down. Pompey agreed to proposals, except he still insisted that Caesar's soldiers should be taken from him. So that's not really agreeing, is it, Pompey? Let's be honest. Cicero then approached Caesar's friends and tried to arrange a compromise. Okay, well, the accepted promises already mentioned and force of only 6,000. But then the consul Lentulus blocks it again. He went out of his way to insult Antony and Curio and drove them out of the Senate in disgrace. So as a result, he gave Caesar the best possible excuse for taking action and supplied him with excellent material for propaganda among his troops. So there's an element of the consuls not thinking things through carefully and playing into Caesar's hand. Because now Caesar, as he said, could show his soldiers, the distinguished men of high office in state, fled from Rome in hired carts, plus the slaves, that if because they were in fear of their lives. Okay. So then it kind of basically describes what Suetonius has already said about him coming into the city. So Caesar had sort of 300 cavalry and 5,000 legionary soldiers. He'd left everyone else behind at this particular point. So basically he thinks it's better to kind of act in surprise in a really unexpected way, because it worked really well for him during the Gallic Wars, to be fair, so he probably was right. He thought it would be easy, he thought, to strike panic into his enemies by acting in a way they never expected than it would be to force them back. So the element of surprise is a really convoluted way of writing that. So he then describes the same thing about watching the gladiators and then Caesar sneaking away. So that's basically what Suetonius has said again. When he came to the river called the Rubicon, blah, 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 he came full of thoughts and he starts to think. He thinks of the sufferings his crossing would bring upon mankind against the Romans, and he imagined the fame of the story of which he would leave to prosperity. So he was kind of torn between, I'm going to cause, a civil war, but I could become really famous, so what should I do? And then slightly different version of the sentence, so let the die be cast, he said, and with these words he hurried across the river, and now he marched at full speed. So he marches then on the city, declaring civil war, declaring war on Pompey and the Senate. Fine. So that gives you a nice overview of basically what happened. Slightly different versions, but essentially the same thing. So what I would recommend doing at some point is making a bit of a timeline of those events using those two particular sources. So I'm now going to scroll back up. Where is it? There it is. To Caesar's version of the event. So what Caesar does in this account is a really clever trick. So he writes in the third person, which is a little bit weird when you're reading it. Now, the reason why he does this is basically to distance himself from what is happening. So by referring to himself, he's not sort of saying, I did this and then I did that. By doing it in the third person, you kind of forget that this is Caesar writing the book. And this whole book is basically Caesar's justification of what happened, and it's also Caesar's propaganda about what happened. But you'll see what I mean as you're reading it through. You do very quickly forget that actually this is Caesar writing his version of the events. So when Caesar's letter was delivered to the consuls, they were with great difficulty. So they tried to read it in the Senate, but the tribunes wouldn't allow it. The tribunes weren't able to do so because the consuls were blocking it. And basically the Senate is unwilling to listen to the letter. So we have Lentulus, promises he will not fail the Senate and the Republic. So he's not even willing to listen to Caesar's letter, which is basically him saying, "I'll give up my soldiers if Pompey gives up his. I just want to run for the consulship with the land, and etc., etc." But it's all Lentulus's fault because he won't even listen to what Caesar has to say. And Lentulus, hang on, let me read this properly. So then Scipio then speaks and says it's Pompey's intention not to abandon the Republic if the Senate would support him. So the element here, if it's Lentulus's fault, we also have Scipio's actions causing problems, and that Pompey was also unwilling to compromise in this particular situation. So this speech of Scipio seemed to have fallen from the lips of Pompey himself. So clearly Caesar is blaming Pompey and Scipio and Lentulus for the situation. It's not Caesar's fault. Marcellus also then gives a speech that the question ought not to be put to the Senate on this matter till levies were made throughout Italy and armies raised under whose protection the Senate might freely and safely pass such resolutions as they thought proper. Pardon, I'll come back to that in a second. And that another guy says Pompey should set out for his province, that there might be no cause for arms, that Caesar was naturally apprehensive as 2 legions were forced from him and Pompey was retaining those troops. So basically he's suggesting that the Senate, through the consuls and others, is escalating the situation by raising an army when Caesar's not done anything yet. Caesar just sent a letter and now they're raising armies. So, what choice did I have but to defend myself when the Senate was being very difficult and Pompey was, setting out for a province with armies, and what choice did I have? So then the Senate, intimidated by the expressions of the consul, by the fears of a present army and the threats of Pompey's friends, unwillingly and reluctantly adopted Scipio's opinion that Caesar should disband his army by a certain day, and should he not do so, he would be considered as acting against the state. So clearly it's Scipio and the Senate. It's not the Senate's fault. The Senate's been forced to act this way by Scipio and his supporters. And it doesn't actually pass, as we already know, in Suetonius and Plutarch. The Senate have a broken for evening. All who belonged to the order were summoned by Pompey, so the Optimates in other words. So he then secures their sort of support. Many veterans from all parts who had served in Pompey's armies were invited to his standard by the hopes of rewards and promotions. So Pompey is forming his army and using bribery and the offer of bribery in order to get supporters. So he draws them up. All the consul's friends, all Pompey's connections, all those who bore any ancient enmity to Caesar were forced into the Senate house. So Caesar's supporters are now being outnumbered by Pompey's alliance system. So they've obviously had a proper falling out at this particular point, and basically they have a discussion about what Scipio and others have suggested and what they're going to do about Caesar. So all the proposals are then rejected, fine, as a result of Scipio and Cato. So an old grudge against Caesar and chagrin at defeat actuated Cato. So Cato's got personal grudge, and that's the cause of it. Lentulus was wrought upon by the magnitude of his debts, so he wants to clear debts, and the hopes of having the government of an army and provinces. So he wants basically the province taken off Caesar so he can go to Gaul and make loads of money, and that's why he's being unfair to Caesar at this particular point. Okay, that's fine. Similar hopes of a province and armies, which he expected to share with Pompey on account of his connection with him, urged on by Scipio. Scipio's really getting it in the neck from Caesar in terms of causing all the problems. So it's everybody's fault except his. It's not Caesar. Caesar is just being targeted by enemies, and it's absolutely awful. Pompey himself, incited again by Caesar's enemies, had wholly alienated himself from Caesar's friendship and procured a reconciliation of their common enemies. And that Pompey himself was anxious to bring matters to a war. So it's not just that all Pompey's faults, according to Caesar. It's a combination of, yes, Pompey has sort of lost his friendship, but he's being egged on by the Optimates, Scipio and Lentulus and Cato, and he's kind of being forced to do something maybe slightly against what he wanted, but also there's an element of jealousy as well. So for these reasons, everything was done in hasty and disorderly manner, so it was rushed through. Neither was time given to Caesar's relations to inform him of the state of affairs. So Caesar's not been informed properly. So again, he's been kind of backed into this corner at the last minute. So recourse is had to that extreme and final decree of the Senate, which was never resorted by even daring proposers, that the consuls, praetors, tribunes, peoples, and proconsuls in the city should take care of that the state received no injury. So basically, he's saying that they have declared war on him, and it's not my fault. It is not my fault. He's done nothing worse than anybody else, and they're saying he's an enemy of the state, and others have done far worse things than he's suggesting. Why are you attacking me? Then the severest and most virulent decrees were passed against Caesar's government. And so Caesar at this time, who was in Ravenna, was awaiting, hang on, let me just highlight that, awaiting answers to his moderate demands. So notice here, this has nothing to do with Caesar. Caesar was being moderate. Caesar was doing the right thing. Caesar was being a good boy, as it were. It's all the Senate's fault. Nothing Caesar did. So then Caesar finds out what's happened. He then speaks to soldiers, reminds him of the wrongs done to him at times by his enemies, and complained that Pompey had been alienated from him. So again, it's not Pompey's fault. He has been kind of manipulated by the Senate and the Optimates, and led astray by them through envy and a malicious opposition to his glory, though he'd always favoured and promoted Pompey's honour and dignity. So it's not Caesar's fault. It's not even Pompey's fault. Pompey's been manipulated. He complained that an innovation had been introduced to the Republic, basically that the Senate was acting beyond what they should have been doing, and therefore it's their fault. Pompey, who pretended to restore what he'd lost, had taken away the privileges they formerly had in terms of the set of the tribunes, and that's why the tribunes had fled to Caesar. And the Roman people were obliged to repair to arms. So this was forcing the people to support Caesar in a civil war. In terms of why his laws are being attacked, he doesn't understand, because there are other people who were, seen as more dangerous to the city. Nothing of this kind of attempted now, not or even thought of. So he's not anywhere near as bad as previous people, but yet he's being attacked. Why are you attacking me? I've done nothing wrong. So he extorted them to defend the malice of his enemies. The reputation and honour of that general under whose command they had for 9 years most successfully supported the state. So he's sort of suggesting to his soldiers, look, I've looked after you for 9 years. We've been very successful. I've extended the empire. I have, promoted Rome. Look how they treat me. Look how they treat me. What am I going to do? And we, worked really hard, and this is it. And, they're going to disband you and treat you badly. You've been fighting for your general for 9 years. He's been paying your pensions. He's paying your wages. He's paying everything. You're going to support your general, let's be honest. And as a result, all cry out that they were ready to defend their general and the tribunes of the commons, all from injuries. So remember, like I said, you kind of forget this is Caesar writing here. None of this is Caesar's fault. Caesar was being moderate. Caesar was, and to be fair, even Suetonius and Plutarch suggest that he was being moderate in his demands, and was just trying to have a bit of self-preservation. But the Senate, for whatever reason, was unwilling to listen to what Caesar wanted. And then the situation obviously then boiled over. We then have a few short letters from Cicero. He's writing to a couple of different people. So giving his particular view of the situation. So the political situation alarms me deeply. I bet it did, because everyone knew what was going on. So far, I've found scarcely anybody's not forgiving Caesar what he demands rather than fighting it out. So he's aware that Caesar's proposal has a lot of popularity. The demand is impudent, no doubt, so it's a little bit outrageous, but more moderate than was expected. So even Cicero, who's an Optimate and an ally of Pompey, is kind of going, to be fair to Caesar, he's actually, not being unfair here. He's actually being a lot better than we thought we would. So he starts to kind of weigh up, what should we do? Should we give him another extension, or allow him to stand in absentia because, it's no worse than the last time we did this? Or did we put these weapons into his hands only to fight him now he's equipped and ready? So was our past behaviour basically has enabled him to build the support he has and has led to this particular situation? So obviously, he says that when he goes to the Senate, I shall vote for peace at any price. So Cicero does not want war, understandably. But in the House, I shall echo Pompey. I shall not do it in a spirit of subservience either. Kind of are. So he's going to support publicly, loudly. He will support whatever Pompey votes for, but he will actually vote for peace if he can help it, because he doesn't particularly want war. So that's fine. So then a few months later, oh, there we go. This is the beginnings of the Civil War, basically. So basically, tying myself in knots. So when Caesar crosses the Rubicon, Pompey and his supporters flee Rome and just kind of leave the city to Caesar. And Caesar marches, takes his treasury and pays his soldiers and goes off and fights. So this is where this is coming in. So Caesar has found out Gnaeus, that's Pompey. There is a faint hope of peace. So this is from Brundisium, which is in Greece. So he's kind of hoping that the two meet, they might be able to, solve it. But if he's crossed over beforehand, there is fear of a deadly war. So if they can't meet in person, then there's going to be a war. But do you see what sort of man this is, into whose hand the state's fallen, how clever, alert, and well prepared? So Caesar been planning this all along? Probably not, to be honest. But he also points out, I cannot think without distress of the blunders and faults on our side which have led to this result. So he's quite critical of the Senate's behaviour, particularly the consul's behaviour, in kind of provoking Caesar's actions. And then we have our final source, which is the final letter. So this is to two men, Oppius and Balbus. So this is on the march. So he's now also left Rome, and he is going to join on Pompey's side. So he was a little indecisive, to be honest, Cicero, about whose side to go on, because he understands where Caesar's coming from, but obviously Pompey is his first love, as it were. So he's a little bit torn. So he decides, on my own accord, decided to show all possible clemency and to do my best to reconcile Pompey. So he decides to go to Pompey's side. Let us try whether by this means we can win back the goodwill of all and enjoy a lasting victory. So he basically wants to try and win over Caesar's supporters in order to sort of take the wind out of Caesar's sails, and therefore people would support Pompey and his side of the army. He has captured a few deserters from memory. If they wish to show themselves grateful, they should urge Pompey to prefer my friendship to that of those who have always been his and my bitter enemies. So there's still this little bit of political manoeuvring going on the two sides of the factions of the Civil War. Cicero is basically going to side with Pompey until he realises Pompey can't win, and then he changes sides because Cicero is a political animal. But you can see people were changing sides as the Civil War continued. So like I said, you've got varying different versions of events going on here. We've obviously got a bit more of the probably accurate story from Suetonius and Plutarch. The two together tell us roughly what's going on. We then have Cicero's views, and he also brings up some of the criticisms of the Senate and some of the Optimates. And then obviously we have Caesar's version, how none of it was his fault. It was all to do with the Senate. Just be aware that we do have these different points of view for the different causes of the Civil War.